Graham Hancock says, "Megalithic sites around the world represent enormous mysteries that we do not understand. I think that the official dating of many of these sites needs to be fundamentally questioned. There are so many unanswered questions about our past that conventional history simply cannot answer. There are also numerous megalithic structures in Japan, but many of these structures have never been properly researched to date." But what is the hotly debated alternate researcher getting at with these words? Well, that becomes clear to us when we consider his basic conviction. After all, Hancock is in no doubt that long before our time, a highly developed civilization lived on Earth that was ultimately completely erased from our collective historical memory. Equipped with exotic technologies that we no longer dare to dream of today, this mysterious people fell victim to a global flood disaster at the end of the last ice age. But despite this, the evidence of their existence is still visible to everyone today. On the one hand, there are corresponding stories of our ancestors, and on the other hand, there are sites such as the controversially discussed Yonaguni Monument, which has caused conservative historians serious difficulties in explaining it. Who hasn't heard of it? A diver near the Japanese island of Yonaguni just wants to explore new diving grounds for tourists, and unexpectedly comes across a series of strange rock formations with strikingly precise edges and angles that allow only one conclusion: it must clearly be a man-made site. And indeed, this was exactly the thought that occurred to Kichiraro Arataki, who made the chance discovery in 1985. And who can blame him? If we take a closer look at the images of the so-called Yonaguni Monument, we see a structure that includes countless step-like platforms and huge stone blocks that appear to have been meticulously cut and then piled on top of each other. The idea that this is supposed to be a mere outgrowth of nature seems at least questionable in this context. And then, of course, there are the astonishing dimensions of this mysterious site. In the photos, the divers almost look like tiny Lego figures. But which advanced civilization created this sunken testimony of the times? Well, if you go by the official doctrine, then the surprising answer is none at all. Because, in fact, the Yonaguni Monument is ultimately just a natural platform created by erosion, which came about when the formation was still within the surf zone. With the end of the Ice Age, so the theory goes, it was then swallowed by the rising sea level, and thus acquired its present appearance. In view of this quote at the beginning, however, it probably comes as no surprise that Graham Hancock's assessment of the Yonaguni Monument is somewhat different. The British author and alternative historian has also studied the structure in detail at close quarters, and not just once, but according to his own account, over 200 dives. Among other things, Hancock passed through a striking tunnel that not only appears to be made of megalithic blocks, but also leads to a massive stone structure that looks as if it has been cut right through the middle. In combination with the holes, which are sometimes interpreted as column foundations, there is no doubt in the mind of the British author that we are dealing here with a structure created by human hands. An impossible testimony? But let us assume that this is really the case, that the Yonaguni Monument is indeed the sunken work of an ancient advanced civilization and not a freak of nature. Why would that actually be so problematic? Well, for one small but all the more crucial reason. According to the established doctrine, there were simply no people in the region at that time who would have been capable of such an architectural masterpiece. Because, as we recall, even the conservative researchers who have nothing to do with alternative interpretations of history state that the Yonaguni Monument has been underwater since the end of the last ice age. To be more precise, we are talking about a time around 8,000 years ago, and thus an era from which we only know the Jomon culture. And while their era dates back to the period between 14,000 and 300 BC, the members of the Jomon culture are by no means known to us as monumental builders, but as simple hunters, fishers, and gatherers who only around 5000 BC began to renounce their nomadic existence and to join together in small villages. And so it happens that the archaeological legacy of the Jomon culture is not composed of colossal large buildings, but primarily of ceramics and pottery. At the end of the day, could it be that the followers of this community were in fact much more advanced than is generally assumed? Well, most alternative researchers also answer this question with a definite no. These include Masataka Kimura, who used to work at Ryukyu University and studied the Yonaguni Monument for decades. And indeed, Kimura also believes that the structure is a man-made rock formation. More precisely, the work of a culture that must have been present in the region about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. But even Kimura does not know who was responsible for the monument in detail, because we would be dealing with the structure of a lost advanced civilization whose background is still hidden in the shadows of the past. The catch, however, is that this assumption is simply in stark contradiction to our understanding of the history of civilization, because, as already mentioned, officially there were only hunters and gatherers back then. But if, and this is the exciting part, the assumptions of Hancock, Kimura and company are one day confirmed, we would not only have to rewrite the history of the Yonaguni Monument, but also the development and true abilities of our distant ancestors. As is well known, the Sumerians are still officially considered to be the first people to have mastered the civilizing hurdle to high culture. The creators of cuneiform writing and artificial irrigation lived in southern Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC, and thus 3,000 to 5,000 years after the hypothetical builders of the Yonaguni Monument. Despite all the exciting alternative beliefs, one thing should not go unmentioned, because there are also critical counter-arguments from the otherwise rather skeptical camp. According to these, geologist Robert Schoch is best known for his controversial redating of the Sphinx, whose true age he pushed back by several millennia based on conspicuous water erosion marks. In the case of the Yonaguni Monument, however, the Boston University professor believes it is a purely natural geological formation. Well, or at least almost. It is conceivable that the locals have polished parts of the rock to make it appear artificial. The mysteries of the floating monolith. From the mysteries of the underwater world back to the surface, or to be more precise, from the depths of the East China Sea straight to Hyogo perfection. Because in fact, a stone something, which is no less enigmatic than the Yonaguni Monument, is enthroned here near the city of Takasago. The bottom line is that the massive monolith called Ishi no Hoden, which is almost 6 meters high, weighs a whopping 500 tons. And yet it is not these astonishing dimensions that make it so much more than just any old boulder. On the one hand, there are its almost ridiculously precisely worked edges, and on the other hand, the fact that the stone colossus seems to float above the water. However, this is not due to an ancient levitation technique, but to a column in the middle of the base which appears invisible at first glance. And basically, researchers suspect that the megalith was never completed, but was left at its original processing point. Not far from the bizarre giant is the Shinto temple, and for a very simple reason. Ishi no Hoden has actually been revered as a shrine for centuries. But what is the story behind this massive structure? What was its purpose, and what do we know about its creators? Well, the official version is that Ishi no Hoden was probably intended as a tomb. However, the somewhat less official version suggests that there is simply no solid evidence for this theory. However, there is also no solid evidence for the assumption that the precise side edges of the rock were hewn into shape using the tools we know of. The typical tool marks only catch our eye under the megalith, at the point where it is attached to a large boulder. Geologists often explain the absence of such marks as a result of erosion, but Ishi no Hoden was covered by debris for a long time. Given this, you might think that it couldn't have been shaped using simple tools like picks and chisels, but then how could it have been created? Well, the short and sweet answer is that we do not know. All that is known for certain is that the rock and the surrounding stone were subjected to a series of modern laser measurements in 2005 and 2006. The experts concluded that Ishi no Hoden consists of hyoclastite, a special volcanic rock that was formed about 70 million years ago. In view of this, many an alternative thinker is probably already thinking of ancient laser or other lost high technologies. But in this case too, the clear evidence is still awaited. The same applies to the contemporary sources of the origin of the boulder. Although Ishi no Hoden is already mentioned in the Harama Fudoki, which dates back to 713 AD, the reason for its construction and the building techniques used are not mentioned at all. but we'll be happy to mention the reason for your click on the subscribe button. Just press your thumb and subscribe now so you never miss a new video from us again. See you soon!